This is the Andrew Lake Podcast, and in this episode, we're talking about transcribing music as a metaphor for how to get more juice out of life. If you are a musician who is late, intermediate to early advanced or advanced skill level, a component of your practice routine will be transcribing music. For those of you who are not musicians, transcribing music is where you write out the music on music notation. It's the dots and the lines on the page. It's written music as opposed to the sound of music. What a musician does when they transcribed music is they listen to it very intensely, and what they hear they write down on the page, and once they've written it down, they learn to play that piece of music, so long as they have enough to string together either a part of a piece of music or the whole piece of music. How a musician does this is by dividing parts of the music, so they will listen to only one instrument at a time, and usually they listen to only one part of the instrument as well, depending on the nature of that instrument. So for example, if it's piano, they might listen to what just one hand is doing on the piano. And they do this in exclusion to all the other parts of the music that are going on around their part. So most musicians learn their part. The more advanced musicians who are interested in a more holistic picture might even transcribe all of the parts of the music. This is quite common among jazz musicians. Jazz music has a rough sort of edge to it because it's largely improvised. So analysis is a bit more difficult than the classical world, where notation is the start of the music. Jazz music isn't always transcribed note for note, and it's not always readily available to musicians, whereas with the classical side, all the notation is there and accessible enough to learn and to analyze. Tony Williams, one of the greatest jazz musicians of all time, who was a jazz drummer in the 60s and 70s, played many styles, played with many amazing musicians, probably most famously with Miles Davis. He was said to have transcribed some of the most advanced drum sequences or patterns from the top jazz musicians of his era. Jazz drummers like Elvin Jones, Roy Haynes, and Max Roach. So these were the drummers that preceded his generation, but were at the top of the game when he was coming through the ranks. Now, Tony Williams took this especially far in that he learnt how to not just transcribe them, but play them note for note. And these are extremely technical pieces of music. It's no small feat that he was able to dig so deep into the styles of these older jazz musicians. And it's really what most people credit his coming to fruition and coming to fame at such a young age. He was able to build a strong technique and have a deep understanding of the music so far beyond anyone else that he could actually learn to play in the gaps and create his own styles of music. And that all came from his deep observation of the music that he was coming out of. The other component of transcribing music is learning to hear and absorb the things that can't be put onto the page. So when music is written out note for note, there are always those little subtleties, those little stretches of beats, accents, inflections, and little ornaments that are not really able to fit into formal notation. So when a jazz musician listens to their recordings and analyze it in a deep and mimicking sort of way, they can pick up on these subtleties and learn to play in a style that is richer and has a deeper understanding that goes beyond the notes on the page. This applies to classical musicians as well as jazz musicians. In fact, really advanced classical musicians learn their music by transcribing it. They listen to a recording and learn it by ear rather than by learning it from the page, because then they can hear different interpretations and compare different recordings of the same pieces and pick up on those subtle differences. In the classical world, there's a tendency to become overly dependent on the written page, and musicians sort of play their way into depending on the music so that they can play. But the really advanced musicians are learning things by ear, and of course, the more you do that, the better you get at it, and then you'll reach a stage further down the line where you're listening and playing it back at quite a rapid rate. You're absorbing the music much quicker. And that's when you get to the point where you can hear the music just once and play it straight back. And it's in there because you've been able to absorb things so quickly because you've practiced the process of absorption. Mozart was probably the most famous musician to be able to do this. At a very young age, he learnt the skill to be able to listen to it once and then have it on demand and able to play it both technically and in terms of his memory. Quite a staggering feat. He's not the only musician ever to have done this. There's a lot of modern musicians who can do this now, but it comes from learning how to absorb, not just doing the absorption. Transcribing music is distinctly different from performing music. It's also distinctly different from listening to music. Musicians often use programs to slow down the music so that it's not moving so fast. And they also isolate parts of the music and dissect it. And this is very different to being in a state of flow or letting the music come out in a performance state. Musicians need to be aware of this because it's possible to get lost in the details. It's possible to become totally absorbed in transcription and forget how to listen in a more broad sort of way. To be effective at integrating transcribing and analysis to your practice, you want to be able to switch between states of listening. So you can listen to music with an analytical mind, and you can listen to music with an absorption mind, and you can also listen to music from an emotional side and hear the entertainment or the ethereal, bigger picture vibe of it. You don't want to get lost in the nitty-gritty and the nuts and bolts. Jazz pianists can often allow this bridge to become blurred, and they'll end up playing licks, which is what we call a section of a transcription, which you repeat in your own playing. So a jazz pianist might be playing something which is their own and they're performing it, and then something they've transcribed will come out as they play, and it's much more natural, much more flowing. It's not as rigid as playing it note for note. And other jazz pianists and other jazz musicians will hear that lick and they'll say, I hear that influence there. I see what's going on there. And there's a whole dynamic around whether that's acceptable or not to copy someone. At a certain stage, I think it is important to express your influences, and there's a whole art to being able to let your expressions happen in an authentic way. And it's quite a funny dynamic whether it's cool or not to quote someone else. Sometimes it's a bit like you're just copying them or you're just showing how flashy you are, and then other times it's considered a cultural reference. And I'm not quite sure how to dissect that. I think it depends on the situation and the environment. Personality has a lot to do with it. But the musician who is mature has that in his bag of tricks. He knows how to play quotes. And of course, really advanced musicians might even have a whole bunch of transcriptions and a whole bunch of licks and choose specifically to not play them. And I think now it's time for our philosophical backflip, which is to ask ourselves, what's the macro expression of this micro metaphor or this micro behavior? How do these principles apply to life and what we do when we're living on a daily basis? Well, let's look at the principles of transcription and transcribing music and see if they apply to how we live our lives. First of all, we pay attention to what's going on, to the exclusion of all other things. And not only that, but we pay attention to a part of what's going on. I think what gets us caught in a whirlwind sometimes in our life is that there's so much always going on. Even right now, you're listening to the sound of my voice, but it's not the only thing that's going on. You've got a whole array of things going into your eyeballs. You've got the air temperature, the air pressure, and the smells that are around you. You've also got the feeling inside your body. You've got an emotional content going on, which is connected to the sound of my voice, what's going on inside your head, and what's going on around you. You might have feelings of the pressure of the seat under your bum or the clothes on your skin. And I think probably maybe a big one for some people out there is the psychological component. You've got this voice in your head which is saying things about what I'm saying, or possibly not even what I'm talking about. You might be thinking about something completely different. You are off somewhere else, and I have to snap you back into attention to be focusing on just that one part of my voice so that you can really understand what it is that I'm saying. So this would be the transcription equivalent of focusing just on one hand of the pianist and excluding the bass player, the other hand of the pianist, the guitarist, the trumpet player, the drummer. Leave all that out. That's all just your environment, your emotions, your thoughts, your feelings, the air temperature, and so on. But you can just concentrate and analyze the very thing that I'm saying and realize the significance of what I'm saying and how you can integrate it into your process of understanding. Another component of transcription is analyzing sections. So jazz music unfolds from start to end, like all music. But there are clear, distinct sections that occur within the start and the end of a song. The same things happen in life. We don't always recognize the end of a chapter in our lives. We don't always know whether something is coming to a climax or not. And if we just take the time to observe and analyze what's going on, then perhaps we'd be better attuned at recognizing these changes in life. The key component of transcribing is absorption. And the key component of performance would be, well, to put it crudely, excretion. When you're performing music, you're putting out, you're expressing something from the inside that goes out to the world. When you're transcribing, you're taking something from the world that goes in to you. Now, we used Tony Williams as an example of someone who transcribes hardcore in music. Perhaps we should find our example for transcribing life in John Francis. So John Francis is an American environmentalist. He is nicknamed the Planet Walker. You can look him up. He's quite famous. He was moved by the 1971 San Francisco oil spill. When he witnessed that, it was quite tragic to him. And his response was to stop talking. It was an epiphany for him that he'd always been saying things. He'd always been talking. He'd always been putting out. He'd always been trying to express himself. And he'd been trying to understand by putting what was in him to outside of the world. And when he witnessed the events of that oil spill, it was more about, well, there was a shift that happened from moving in to the out to the out to the in. And he stopped talking and started listening to people. He started observing what people were saying. He started really to absorb the things that people thought and the things that people had inside their head. And that was a big revolution for him, and he ended up going 17 years without speaking. He also did a whole bunch of other things, including giving up oil-based transport, fossil fuel transport, and that's how he got the nickname Planet Walker. But that gives you a bit of an idea about what it's like to observe life and come into an understanding by taking things in rather than putting out. There are many people throughout human history who have made this shift from speaking to listening. And it's the people who have done this that have the richest things to say. They've thought about and processed the observations that they've had, and that's what brings a freshness to the things they say. I think for us to come into more understanding, we need to develop the ability to analyze, to observe, to process things on a deeper level. To do that, we can do the exact same process as what it takes to transcribe music, which is to isolate parts, take in parts as they are, mimic them, and this can really help to enforce a stronger understanding of what it is that makes us up, what it is that we're composed of, what it is that we're putting out when we perform. And I think it's a dynamic that we should all keep in mind and integrate into our routine, our processes of living. My name is Andrew. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll be back soon with more. Listen to some Tony Williams. Incredible drummer.